Hi, I'm Mark Lieberman at Nostalgic Motoring Limited, and I'm here today to talk about an important historic car. This 1913 Model T Speedster. Model Ts were the cars that put America on wheels, and they built over 15 million of these cars. Well, back in 1913, this was America's first set of personal transportation. How do you get out on the road? Well, most likely it was going to be in a Model T if you were driving something in the early teens. This particular car is very unusual in that it's largely a survivor. The car came to me through the original family that owned this car since 1929. And amazingly enough, the car's never been restored. The car was painted once in 1951, and it sat in the same building since 1952, where we discovered it and pulled it out of its quiet resting place. Well, let's take a tour around this car and learn why it's so special. In 1913, if you were shopping for a Model T, you could purchase one for a few $100s. And interestingly enough, you could get them in a variety of different configurations. There were sedans and roadsters. This particular one is a speedster, but it was set up to be raced, not necessarily to transport the family around. The car was originally built in a different configuration, and then the first owner purchased a Columbia body. That's what it sports today. And the bodies were accessories you could purchase out of a catalog in order to dress your car up, set it up for, in this instance, racing. So this Columbia body was purchased and installed in place of the original body. Now it still retains its original frame, it still retains its original axles, chassis components and so forth. They just put the new body on it and then started to modify the car in order to make it a hot rod of the time. These cars originally came with a 177 cubic inch four-cylinder engine that produced a whopping 20 horsepower. That made this car capable of going 42 miles an hour, which at the time, for most people, that was plenty fast. Well, they wanted to make this one more competitive. Racing was just getting started, and as a result, they were going to modify the engine. Now, state-of-the-art technology at the time was not terribly dissimilar to some of the things that we see in today's cars. Let's have a look under the hood. Well, probably the most distinguishable feature that you'll see under here is this unusual cylinder head configuration. Originally, these cars were L-head. The valves came up from the block itself. Well, now you see overhead valve, and not just any overhead valve. Here you've got a configuration that was not seen for many years later. So this accessory head, which was made by Roof, was very unusual. It provided 4 valves per cylinder, a 16-valve unit, overhead valve, something that's commonplace today, unheard of in the teens or 20s. So this was a 1920s modification. In fact, all the modifications that you're going to see on this were done in the 20s and 30s. So you have the new cylinder head configuration, you have an updraft air friction carburetor, a Bosch magneto, and another really interesting innovation that we can look at on the other side. So on this side of the engine, we're going to see something that was very unusual at the time, and virtually on every engine that you see today, a water pump. Now, Model Ts did not have a standard water pump at the time. They used convection cooling, so heat caused the circulation of the water to go through the radiator. Well, this had a water pump installed so it could pump that coolant through the radiator and cool this engine more efficiently. From this side of the engine, you can also better see the 4 valves per cylinder. Commonplace now, but again, a very exotic option at that point in time that you could only buy with this accessory head. Now, as you see, there is no valve cover, and they didn't have those at that time, and this oil lubrication system was considered a total loss system. Now, that is exactly what it implies. It's a total loss. So what happens is you pump oil up here through the push rods in order to oil the cylinder head, and you could oil it by hand as well with this factory Ford logoed oil pump, and you could go ahead and use this can and lubricate those valves one at a time. So as you would have oil pumped here towards the top of the cylinder head, it would run down along the side of the motor and be lost on the road. So one of the other things that you're going to notice in this is right on the top of the radiator, you have this dial indicator that has virtually a thermometer set in the center of it, and this is the temperature gauge. Now, a little difficult to see from the driver's vantage point, but this is all that they had at that point in time in order to tell you at what temperature this engine was running. Are you overheating, or is the engine still cold? Well, you had to look at the thermometer inside of this small glass bezel. One of the modifications that they made for this for racing is the dropped axles. This lowered the overall height of the car, gave it a little better handling and more stability. They modified changed the wheels with these larger wire wheels in order to give this more tractability when they raced it on, of course, a dirt track. And then while they used the stock headlight configuration, you'll see back on the other side of this, they added a spotlight. Now, the spotlight was not set up here for racing, but we're going to get into what they use this for here in just a minute. Next, let's have a look at this somewhat less than luxurious interior. Two very functional bucket seats, high bolsters on the side in order to hold you in place. As you see, a complete lack of seat belts or any other safety equipment. So this seat was virtually all that was going to hold you in place, other than the grip that you kept on the steering wheel. Now you'll notice that just like with all other Model Ts, you had a 3-pedal configuration. Those 3 pedals are very different than what we're accustomed to today, as one of those pedals is actually reverse, one pedal is forward, and the other pedal is brake. 2-speed selector for the transmission, and then something that was very new and innovative at the time, a gas pedal. This is not something that these cars had, where the throttle was controlled up here on the steering column. For racing, they added a gas pedal. Very unusual. And then also the other lever here is for spark advance. Now when you look at the dashboard, you see the complete absence of any type of instrumentation. The only thing that you see is a sight glass here, which drips oil. And that tells you that oil is still circulating in the motor. That was the only semi-instrument that you got in this particular configuration. Now on the floor, we have a button here in the center, which is the exhaust cutout. Again, for racing, we wanted as little resistance to the exhaust and back pressure that you could get, so they made an exhaust system, an open air cutout that allowed this thing to really roar. Now, with all of these modifications that we talked about in the engine and the exhaust cutout, this car more than doubled the horsepower that it was originally configured with. So it was probably a 45 horsepower machine and maybe capable of going, who knows, 50 or 60 miles an hour. I wasn't there, but I can tell you that from the stories that I'm told from the son of one of the early owners of this, this was quite a race car. Now, back in the early days, once it had been retired from racing, his family actually used this as a driver. Interestingly enough, they used to drive this car in Michigan between Ionia and Jackson on a regular basis. Now, this was in the 1940s. The roads were very questionable, and the idea of driving this hundreds of miles is really an amazing, if not daunting, consideration. Now, when you think about this as well, when his father and his mother used to drive this thing, oftentimes his sister was sitting on the floorboards in between his mother's legs for that entire ride. And I spoke with her as well regarding her memories of those early days. And it was very interesting, her perspective on the time when they would drive this thing long distance with her basically just huddled on the floor for that time. A little scary today. One of the other things that we should consider too is how well this has been preserved. Other than a paint job, this car is original. In fact, so original that many of the original tools are kept here in the trunk still. So you have back here many of the things that you would want to have if you were taking this car on the road for any type of distance whatsoever. A spare magneto, well, of course, everybody needs one of those. An air pump, well, the tires were often subject to nails or other debris. You need to inflate them. Well, if you've got a puncture, what do? Yes, you've got to have your tire repair kit. Many people drove with extra spark plugs, as you see in here. Lots of additional tools, spare nuts and bolts, and as you look through here, you'll see other unusual things like tire chains, a grease pump. The crank, of course, to start it, this did not have an electric start, so this was a hand start. In fact, what they often did with this particular car is they'd put a jack underneath the rear axle and spin the rear tire in order to fire this thing up. Now, one of the other things that you'll notice on this particular car, as being a 1913, you only had two-wheel brakes. Notice drums on the left and the right, only in the rear. So if you were going to stop, you were counting on these babies to stop. And these tires are very old, and I expect that they, while they were serviceable back in the day, they didn't provide a whole lot of traction. Very interesting. In the early teens, you would buy an automobile and it would come with but one taillight. Anything more than that was an option, and of course there was no brake light. This was just for driving at night. It would glow red, and that was the sole amount of visual appearance that you would have to somebody else that was out in the road. And these were pretty unusual and interesting to see when they were out, and relatively rare sighting in the rural areas where this particular car came from. So naturally, when they were driving these cars at distance, one of the problems was light. How do you see at night? Well, they had the two headlights. This car doesn't have a battery. It has this magneto in order to generate power. It doesn't generate a whole lot of energy in order to light those headlights. So they added this accessory spotlight to hopefully give them a little more vision in the dead of night when they were driving these on rural roads. That had to be scary as all get out. So what other history do we have aside from this amazing preservation example of the Model T Speedster? The accessories that they used when they were operating the car back in the 30s and 40s. We have the original leather helmet with the goggles that he used in racing. The original jacket that he wore when he raced this car. The leather gauntlet gloves. These were all period accessories that the family had and used back in the day when they operated this car. An amazing additional piece of ephemera to be included with the history of this car. Just an amazing piece, and an important piece of history that reminds us where did we come from in the evolution of these automobiles, and how important was this car in the day to teach us about what was ahead. You know, racing inspired us to make cars faster and make cars better. They did this way back in 1913, and that spirit drives us today to build supercars and other incredible vehicles that take us to where we're headed tomorrow.